Paying debt with debt, the greatest financial trick in the world. Imagine maxing out your credit cards, then turning around, and lending yourself the money to pay them off. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? If you tried that, you'd be bankrupt within months. And yet, that's exactly what the United States does. When the government needs money, it issues bonds, and then buys those same bonds back through its own central bank, the Federal Reserve. In other words, it sells its own debt to itself. It sounds absurd, doesn't it? On paper, it looks like America is paying itself with money it doesn't have. But in reality, it's the biggest financial illusion in history. And here's the twist. The entire global economy is built on top of this trick. So the real question is this an act of genius, or just a beautifully disguised illusion? And the most important one of all, how long can this game really last before it cracks? The birth of bonds and the power of an IOU. A government bond is really just a promise, a written "I owe you." The government says, lend me your money now and I'll pay you back later with interest. Simple, right? But that simple idea became the foundation of America's entire financial system. Every time the U.S. Treasury issues a bond, one thought echoes through investors' minds. America always pays. And that belief, that trust, has kept the nation running for more than 2 centuries. Even though the U.S. has spent more than it earns year after year, investors keep lending because they believe in the promise. This story goes all the way back to the very beginning, the birth of the nation itself. When the Revolutionary War ended, the government owed money to soldiers, suppliers, even to France. The country was drowning in debt. That's when the first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, had an idea. He said, let's pay our old debts with new bonds as long as we never lose trust. And it worked. America paid its debts. Investors believed again. Money flowed back in. But that success also created a cycle, a pattern that would never end. Borrow, pay off, borrow again. From that moment on, debt became the lifeblood of the American economy. The rise of the Federal Reserve. Then came 1913, the year everything changed. The United States created the Federal Reserve. Before that, America's banking system was chaotic, fragile, plagued by panics, crashes, and waves of fear. The Fed was designed to bring order, to be a lender of last resort. But over time it became something more, the government's financial partner in debt. When World War II broke out, the Treasury needed mountains of money. The Fed stepped in and said, don't worry, I'll buy the bonds. And just like that, America had created demand for its own debt. The Fed printed money and used that money to buy government bonds. The result? The United States could borrow cheaply and endlessly. A perfect loop. Money created, debt purchased, system sustained. The machine had started turning, and it hasn't stopped since. 1971, the end of the gold standard. Then came 1971, the year the rules of the game changed forever. Up until that moment, the US dollar was tied to gold. If you wanted to, you could take your dollars and exchange them for real gold. The system gave the dollar weight, something tangible behind the promise. But wars are expensive. The Vietnam War, social programs, and massive domestic spending began to strain America's finances. The world started to doubt whether the U.S. could really back all those dollars with gold. And then it happened. President Richard Nixon went on television and announced, "We are no longer converting dollars into gold." With one sentence, the foundation of the global monetary system shifted. The gold standard was gone. From that day on, the dollar was backed by only one thing: trust. Its value no longer came from metal, but from belief. And that belief spread around the world, because every country holding dollars was now holding paper. Paper sustained only by confidence. The age of money by faith had begun. And it didn't just reshape America. It rewired the entire global economy. The heart of modern finance, the bond cycle. So how does this system work today? Have you ever really thought about it? When the U.S. government spends more than it earns, the Treasury steps in and issues bonds, promises to repay later with interest. Those bonds are snapped up by investors around the world, foreign governments, massive pension funds, banks, insurance companies. They all want a piece of what's considered the safest investment on earth. But when that demand begins to fade, the same old savior steps back onto the stage: the Federal Reserve. The Fed creates money digitally, literally by typing numbers into existence. Then it uses that newly created money to buy U.S. Treasury bonds. Fresh money enters the system, and the cycle begins again. It sounds theoretical, but it's not. We've seen it happen over and over. During the 2008 financial crisis, and again during the pandemic, the Fed bought trillions of dollars in bonds, effectively financing government spending with money made out of nothing. In other words, the U.S. was lending money to itself, a nation borrowing from its own imagination, and the world just watched, because that illusion keeps the system alive, creating money from money, the magic and the cost. It sounds unbelievable, doesn't it? How can a country lend money to itself? How can it print wealth out of thin air and call it prosperity? But it's exactly how modern finance works. Wars are financed this way. Stimulus checks are printed this way. Banks are rescued this way when the system trembles. From the outside, it looks like magic, money appearing from nowhere, saving everyone. But every magic trick has a cost. And here's the truth: that cost isn't paid by Washington or Wall Street. It's paid quietly by you. You feel it every time you go to the store, every time prices rise faster than your paycheck, every time your savings lose a bit more of their worth. That invisible cost has a name: inflation. It's not just numbers on a screen. It's the silent tax of modern finance, the price of believing in money that's made from nothing, the hidden tax, the true face of inflation. Let's strip it down to the basics. The Treasury needs money because the government spends far more than it collects. In simple terms, there's a hole in the budget. So what does it do? It issues bonds. Countries like China and Japan buy them. Big investment funds and banks buy them. But the most important buyer isn't any of them. It's always the same institution, the Federal Reserve. Now here's where the trick happens. The Fed doesn't raise taxes. It doesn't save up cash. It simply creates money by pressing a few keys on a computer, literally out of nothing. Then it uses that digital money to buy the government's bonds. The government borrows, the Fed supports, and the loop begins again. That's how America finances itself, with invisible money. And every time there's a crisis, this process returns. During the 2008 collapse, the Fed called it quantitative easing. It printed trillions. During the pandemic, it printed even more. If they hadn't done it, the government would have faced two impossible choices: double taxes or cut spending in half. Neither was politically survivable. So, instead, they printed their way out. It worked, but only on the surface. Because while the numbers looked stable, the real cost shifted, quietly, onto everyone else, winners and losers. So who wins in this game, and who loses? The winners are easy to spot. Politicians, because they get to spend without ever raising taxes. Banks and big investors, because every wave of new money pushes their assets higher. And foreign governments, for now, because U.S. bonds are still seen as the safest bet on Earth. But the losers? That's us, ordinary people. Every time new money is created, the value of what's already in your pocket quietly shrinks. Prices rise, paychecks fall behind, savings melt away. And that feeling, that slow, creeping loss, that's inflation. It's the hidden tax that keeps the system alive, a tax that no one votes for, but everyone pays. The addiction to debt and the fragility of an empire. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, it's only getting heavier. Today, America's national debt has blown past $30 trillion, and it's still climbing every single day. And something else has changed. The biggest foreign lenders, countries like China and Japan, they're quietly stepping back. They're buying fewer U.S. bonds than ever before. That means America is turning inward, relying more and more on its own central bank to keep the wheel turning. More printed money, more inflation, more fragility built into the system itself. And history has seen this before. Every empire that rose to power financed itself the same way. Britain built its navy and colonies on mountains of debt. It worked until the pound collapsed. 18th century France played its own money games until the paper promises fell apart and revolution followed. The lesson is always the same. Debt can build an empire. But once trust disappears, the entire structure crumbles. The empire of the dollar. And the cracks in trust. So why does America still stand tall? Despite all this, because it holds one extraordinary power, the dollar. The U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. Oil is priced in dollars. Global trade is settled in dollars. And central banks everywhere keep U.S. treasuries as their safest reserves. It's a self-feeding cycle. America borrows, the world buys, and the dollar stays dominant. But lately, that cycle has started to crack. The BRICS nations are building their own systems of trade. Central banks across the globe are quietly hoarding gold again. And whispers of de-dollarization are getting louder every year. Because deep down, the world is beginning to ask the same question. What if the dollar isn't the safe haven anymore? And that question matters, because this isn't just some abstract global game. It touches your life directly. Every paycheck, every savings account, every price tag in every store. Every time the Fed buys more bonds, more money floods the system. And every new dollar makes the ones you already hold worth a little less. That's why inflation feels like theft. Because it is. A silent transfer of wealth from the many to the few. From workers to asset holders, from trust to illusion. The collapse of trust. And history's warning, this system survives only as long as people believe in it, as long as they trust the paper, as long as they trust the promise behind the numbers. But when that trust fades, everything changes. Look back at Weimar Germany in the 1920s, a nation that tried to pay its debts by printing money. At first it worked. Then the flood came. Prices doubled, then tripled, then became meaningless. People carried cash in baskets, and savings vanished overnight. Fast forward to the 1970s. When Nixon cut the dollar loose from gold, confidence cracked again. The dollar collapsed. Inflation soared into double digits. Americans lined up for gasoline, clutching bills that bought less every week. And after decades of quantitative easing, from 2008 to the pandemic, we're starting to see those same echoes once more. Rising prices, housing bubbles, and a fragile, overstretched economy. But the real danger isn't just inflation, it's fragility. Because if foreign buyers lose faith in U.S. treasuries, America will be forced to finance its own debt at home. That means even more money creation, even more inflation, and even more pressure on the very trust that keeps the dollar alive. When that trust breaks, the system shakes. And just like every empire before it, America too will face the bill. Real awareness and personal responsibility. True financial awareness begins when you finally see through the illusion, when you understand that government debt isn't free, that inflation is a hidden tax, and that the entire system stands on a single fragile foundation, trust. That's when the real questions begin. If the system shakes, do you own anything that holds real value? If inflation rises, will your savings survive? If confidence in bonds fades, what happens to your paycheck, your pension, your home? Because when this game finally falters, it won't be Washington that pays the price. It won't be Wall Street either. It will be you and me. Everyone who believed that paper could last forever. Every illusion ends the same way, slowly, then all at once. History repeats. The fall of empires and the debt that built them. History never repeats itself word for word, but it always rhymes. Britain once built its empire on borrowed money. When trust disappeared, the empire fell. France drowned in debt long before revolution swept it away. Paper promises burned, and a nation rose from the ashes. Now America plays the same tune, borrowing endlessly, buying its own debt, pretending the game can last forever. But no illusion lasts forever. Every empire that thought it could outsmart debt eventually met the same end. The question isn't if this one will end. The question is when. If this story opened your eyes, stay curious. Because history doesn't just tell us where we've been. It shows us where we're going. And if you listen closely, you might hear it whisper the same warning it's spoken for centuries. Every illusion ends. If this story gave you something to think about, hit like and subscribe. Because on this channel, history doesn't just talk about the past, it reveals the present.